It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. A small beach house tucked away on the outskirts of town, far from the chaos of everyday life. My friends and I were excited for a weekend retreat. Just the five of us. We rented the place online, just a simple listing with a few pictures, nothing out of the ordinary. But as soon as we arrived, something felt off. The house looked fine from the outside, a bit older than expected, but nothing that raised any red flags. It had a quiet charm to it, the kind of place you could imagine getting lost in. The ocean breeze hit us as we stepped inside, a little too fresh, a little too cold. It was like the air itself had a chill that didn't belong. But we shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the wind coming off the water. We unpacked, settled in, and the first night was peaceful. We spent hours sitting around, telling stories and laughing. But by the second evening, things started to take a strange turn. It began with small things. Nothing big, nothing you could really point to. A picture on the wall that seemed crooked, just a little. Enough to make you wonder if you were imagining it. A creak in the floorboards followed by a soft knock on the door when no one was there. The kind of noises you could ignore, but after a while you start to question if it's all in your head. One of my friends, Mark, was the first to mention it. He claimed he'd heard footsteps when we were all sitting in the living room. The kind of heavy, deliberate steps that sounded like someone was pacing upstairs. The thing was, there was no one else in the house. The only rooms upstairs were locked, and none of us had been up there since we arrived. At first we laughed it off. Maybe it was just the house settling, old wooden beams groaning with the weight of time. But as the evening wore on, the oddities started to add up. There was a constant, oppressive sense of being watched, like something was hovering just out of sight, waiting. It didn't help that the beach house was isolated. No neighbors, no passing cars, just the sound of waves crashing against the shore and the silence between us. By the third night, things got worse. I was the last to go to bed, as usual, but as I walked down the hallway toward my room, I noticed something strange. The lights flickered as I passed them, not in the usual way, but as if they were struggling to stay on. I paused, staring at the bulb in the hallway. For a brief second, it felt like I was in a completely different place. Something about the invisible line. I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to feel uneasy. The air felt thick, as if something was pressing against my chest. I stepped into my room, locked the door behind me, and tried to sleep. But it wasn't easy. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger, and I kept hearing soft noises coming from the walls. Scratching, tapping, faint whispers that I couldn't quite make out. I told myself it was just the wind, the house shifting in the dark. Then, at around 3 a.m., I woke up to a soft sound, like someone crying. It wasn't loud, but it was there, just faint enough to make you question if it was real. My heart raced, and I tried to ignore it, but it only got louder. It was coming from upstairs. I lay frozen, staring at the ceiling, wondering if anyone else was hearing it. Eventually, I gathered the courage to get up and check. When I reached the stairs, I stopped, dead in my tracks. The door to the upstairs hallway was slightly ajar. I hadn't left it open. Neither had anyone else. The sound of crying, no longer muffled, was clear now, echoing down the hall. It sounded like a woman, a low, pitiful sobbing that made my blood run cold. I turned back, rushing to my friends' rooms. I knocked on each door, waking them up in a panic. Mark was the first to get up. He looked as terrified as I felt. "You heard it too?" he whispered. We all agreed to check upstairs together. It was the only way we'd get any answers. or so we thought. We crept up the stairs, trying to stay as quiet as possible. But the crying kept growing louder. It wasn't just a sound. It was like it was getting inside our heads, pressing in on us. The upstairs hallway stretched before us, dark and still. We approached the room where the sound seemed to be coming from. The door was ajar, just as I had left it, but when we opened it fully, we found nothing inside. No one was there. The room was empty, except for a small chair in the corner. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the mirror. There was a crack running through the center of it, but it wasn't a natural crack. It was perfectly straight, as if someone had deliberately split it. I stared at my reflection, and for a moment, I didn't recognize myself. It felt like I was staring into someone else's eyes, someone who was trapped inside that mirror, watching. We didn't speak. We just turned and left. We didn't talk about the crime at all, but we all knew there was something in that. Something from the past, maybe, or something we couldn't even understand. We left early the next morning, packed our bags in silence, and drove away, not once looking back. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was just our minds playing tricks on us, a collective paranoia brought on by isolation. But there's one thing I'm sure of. That beach house wasn't just old. It was holding on to something. Something that wanted to be felt. Something that made sure we never forgot it. The strange thing is, I found out months later that the house had been abandoned for years before we rented it. The owners had disappeared without a trace, and no one ever figured out what happened to them. And now, whenever I pass that stretch of beach, I can't help but wonder if it's still there, waiting for the next people to rent it, just to make sure they hear its story.